Welcome back, everybody, to Book 3 of the Royal Ranger series, The Duel at Araluen. And today we're going to be getting into Chapter 20. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get into it. Castle Araluen had been quiet for the past day. There had been no attacks on the stairwell, no new machines to threaten the defenders. There had been no sign of Damone. No further word from him since his admittance to Cassandra that he had given up and would be leaving for Sonderland. Nevertheless, Cassandra refused to let herself be lulled into a sense of false security. Recent events had taught her to distrust Damone implicitly. She sensed he was up to something, and that his capitulation was a sham. As a result, she insisted that her men maintain the high level of vigilance they had assumed from the start of the siege. She had Merlon and several other senior soldiers checking constantly on sentries, ensuring they weren't slacking off, and allowing the apparent lack of activity from the enemy to make them careless. And she kept a watch over Merlon and the others herself, ensuring that they remained at the highest possible level of attentiveness as well. She discussed the situation with her father, grateful for any advice he might offer. "Stay patient," he told her. "This is the hardest part of a siege. It's easy to remain alert when you're under attack, but it's different when nothing happens hour after hour. Your senses become dulled, and your attention can wander." As a result, she set and maintained a regular schedule of patrolling for herself, striding around the terrace that surrounded the south tower, checking the castle yard below, inspecting the keep for any sign of activity through its windows, and studying the other three towers and the battlements on the curtain walls that joined them. Then she would descend to the 8th floor and check the sentries at the stairwell, studying the wooden barrier that had barred the way to the lower stairs for any signs that the foxes had attempted to damage it or degrade it. She would break that schedule at irregular intervals as the mood took her, and begin extra impromptu inspections. It was all too easy, she realized, to become complacent with the fixed schedule. Changing that at random was necessary to maintain focus on her surroundings and the movement of her enemies. It also kept her own men on their toes. If they had no idea when or where she might appear to check on them, they had little choice but to stay alert at all times, not just those times when they knew she was scheduled to inspect them. It was mid-morning, and she was on one of her surprise inspections, starting at the balcony around the 9th floor, when she saw it. From the lofty observation point, she had an excellent overview of the main gate and drawbridge. They were set in the southeast wall of the castle, down to her right, enabling her to keep track of the comings and goings below. It was the noise that first drew her attention. There was a low rumbling sound from the gate. She realized that the massive drawbridge was being lowered. The upper part of the wall hid the actual bridge from her sight, but the noise was unmistakable. "Listen to that," she said to Ingrid. The girl had taken to accompanying Cassandra on her rounds, ready to take notes of any slackness in the defenders, or any actions that might need to be taken. There was usually very little note-taking to be done. "They're opening the gates," Ingrid said. Then she pointed down into the courtyard. "Look there, my lady." The stables were set on the northeast wall, where their view was slightly blocked by the keep tower. As Ingrid pointed, a double file of horsemen began to trot out into the courtyard, their horses' hoofs clattering on the flagstones. The men were dressed in the same uniforms they had worn when they first infiltrated the castle, with helmets, chainmail overshirts, and red surcoats. Their round shields, painted red with a yellow X, were slung on their backs. They all carried their long lances, stepped into the holding sockets on their right stirrups, so that the shafts were held vertically. Cassandra estimated there were about 40 in the party, although she noted with grim satisfaction that their numbers were fewer than they had been when they first arrived. Their attempted attacks on the stairs and with the trebuchet had thinned their ranks somewhat. As the riders trotted toward the gatehouse in a double file, they were joined by another mounted man, cantering his horse to take the lead. Even from this distance, Cassandra could see that he had resumed the fox mask that he had worn days before concealing his identity. "Damone," she said quietly, as the lead rider clattered under the massive archway, the rest of his force following behind him in 2 files. Ingrid grunted in reply. "Looks like he meant what he said," she observed, a note of surprise in her voice. Cassandra made no reply. The 2 files of horsemen were hidden from sight for several minutes. Then they reappeared on the grassy field outside the walls and wheeled right to head downhill to the forest, with Damone in the lead. Cassandra and Ingrid moved around the terrace to keep them in sight. As the men rode out of the shadow of the walls, the morning sun struck their helmets, setting them gleaming. "My lady," said Ingrid slowly, after a minute or so, "do you notice something odd about those riders?" Cassandra peered more carefully, trying to see what the girl might be referring to. After several seconds, she shook her head. "Not that I can see. What is it?" She realized that Ingrid's eyes were younger than hers, and her vision was sharper. She sighed inwardly. One of the penalties of growing older, she thought. "Their helmets are gleaming in the sunlight," Ingrid began. Cassandra turned to look at her, frowning, not seeing the significance of that remark. "Helmets tend to do that. They're metal, after all." Ingrid nodded, but then pointed at the mounted men. "But their spear points aren't," she said. Cassandra jerked her eyes back to the troopers. Ingrid was right. The sunlight danced and gleamed off the bobbing helmets, but there was no matching reflection from the heads of the lances they all carried, which could only mean that the spear points weren't metal. "And look at the way they're all sitting," Ingrid continued. "They're slumped, with their left hands on the pommels of their saddles, not on the reins. All of them. And some of them don't look as if they're completely at home on horseback. They're bouncing around like sacks of potatoes." "What are you saying?" Cassandra asked, although she had already half-guessed the answer. "They're tied on." Ingrid sounded much surer of herself, as if her initial doubts had been dispelled. "Their left hands are tied to their saddle pommels. Their right hands have been left free to hold their spears, except they're not spears. They're just long sticks. Those men are prisoners," she said with growing conviction in her voice. "They're not Damone's troops." Cassandra nodded slowly, looking at the girl admiringly. "Which means Damone's troops are still inside the castle," she said. "Yes, and I'll wager that man leading them out isn't Damone. I'll bet he's still inside as well. So he wants us to think he's gone. Which means we'll come down from the tower. and find him and his troops somewhere down there, lying in wait for us. Well spotted, Ingrid. Cassandra laid her hand on the younger woman's shoulder. At that moment, a soldier came onto the terrace, holding a message bag in his hand. My lady, we just found this on the stairs. Must have been thrown up past the barrier earlier this morning. He handed the bag to Cassandra. It was a small, weighted canvas sack, designed to hold a written message, and be thrown over battlements or other defensive positions. She took out the single sheet of vellum inside, glanced at the seal, and broke it, unrolling the message. From Damone, she said, unnecessarily. Then she handed the sheet to Ingrid, after reading it herself. Farewell, Cassandra. Do not try to follow me. I have taken several of your people with me as hostages, and they'll suffer if you do. The others are in the dungeons below the keep. They're probably running low on food and water, as I saw no reason to feed them. Remember to keep looking over your shoulder. I'll be back one day, when you least expect it. D. Ingrid read the message aloud, folded the sheet again. Clever, isn't it? Cassandra said. He warns me not to follow, tells me he has hostages, and threatens me for the future. And buried in there is the message that our people are imprisoned, with no food or water, more or less as an aside. Designed to have you hurrying down the stairs to the dungeons to set them free, Ingrid said, nodding slowly. Exactly. And somewhere down there, I'll find Damone and his men, armed and ready to attack us. She shook her head. He's a treacherous snake, isn't he? He's using your own good nature against you, Ingrid said. He knows that you wouldn't leave your people short of food or water. She paused, then added, On the other hand, what? Cassandra asked. Ingrid seemed reluctant to answer, but eventually she spoke. On the other hand, I could be wrong about the spear points and the riders. Maybe he has left, and maybe there are prisoners in the dungeon who need food and water. Cassandra studied her worried face for a few moments, then replied, Well, there's one way to find out. Ingrid looked at her in alarm. You're not planning on going down the stairs? Cassandra smiled and shook her head. No, I'm definitely not planning that. On the 9th floor, Cassandra moved to the secret door where Maddie had entered from the hidden stairs that ran down to ground level. She stopped to take a lantern from a hook, lighting it with a taper from a box over the fireplace. She slipped the latch and opened the door, peering in. For a moment, her head swam as she looked down into the black depths. The lantern illuminated only the first 5 or 6 meters, and she had a dislike of cramped, dark places. Steeling herself, and with a quick, nervous grin to Ingrid, who was standing by, watching anxiously, she stepped in and began to descend the ladders that led to the dungeons. She moved slowly, testing each step before she placed her full weight on it. Maddie had mentioned that one of the rungs had given way beneath her weight when she had initially climbed up, and Cassandra had no wish to go plummeting down through the darkness. As she passed the main stairway between the 7th and 8th levels, she could see a dim light where her men had removed the section of stairs. Then the darkness closed in again. There were observation holes on the platforms at each floor, and, as she reached each one, she would move toward it, keeping the lantern shielded, and listen. Then she put her eye to the spy hole and look. For the first 4 floors, she heard and saw nothing. Then, at the level of the 4th floor, she heard a low murmur of voices. Putting her eye to the spy hole, she studied the room inside the tower. This was the level where the arched stone bridge connected the south tower to the keep. It was the most likely point of egress if she and her men were to vacate their sanctuary. At least, that appeared to be what Damon thought. A large group of his men, fully armed and armored, were lounging on the floor inside the big, open room, talking in low tones among themselves as they awaited developments. As she watched, a knowing smile formed on her lips. The door from the bridge opened, and Damon himself strode in. He looked around angrily. "Keep your voices down," he hissed, and the mumble of conversation died away. That won't last, she thought. As soon as Damon left, the conversations would start up again. You couldn't keep soldiers from talking, usually grumbling about their lot. Damon prowled restlessly around the room. He stopped by one of the troops, a sergeant by his insignia. "Any sign of them yet?" he asked. The sergeant shook his head. "No, my lord." Damon swore softly. "Well, stay alert. They'll be coming down soon. Send someone for me when you hear them coming. Get your men out of sight, and let them come into the main hall here. Then surround them. But wait until you see Cassandra. I want her taken." "Yes, my lord." "And raise that drawbridge again. I don't want to risk having it down if Horus suddenly shows up." The sergeant frowned. "Won't they realize we're still here if the drawbridge is up?" Damon shot an exasperated look at him. "They can't see the bridge itself from the tower," he said. "Raise it slowly, so they can't hear you doing it." He whirled angrily on the men lounging behind him, talking quietly among themselves. "Keep the darn noise down, for pity's sake. We're supposed to be long gone." The man fell silent, and Damon stalked away, heading for the bridge that led to the keep. "My lord, indeed," Cassandra said in a low, sardonic voice. Then she began slowly climbing back to the 9th floor. And that is going to bring us to the end of chapter number 20. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you next time in chapter 21. God bless, and have a good one.